Couple turn delivery truck into mobile home and get out of paying hefty tax. They couldn't wait for when they could start on the next step, but they had to wait a few weeks for the insulation to be put in. Things became tricky when they could finally start dividing the space into different sections. They needed to carefully consider where everything would go so the delivery truck would be a suitable living space. What had they gotten themselves into? Owning property is usually what most young adults look forward to as they settle into their 20s. The idea of coughing out cash in the name of rent is as painful as the thought of being an independent adult. For some, paying rent is motivation enough to work hard so they can buy a home they can call theirs. But for others, rent becomes an everlasting cloud over their lives. Brody Redfield and his fiancée, Annie, had been together for half a decade before they decided to get married. Both starting their careers after college, they'd expected life to be easy. But the realities of adulthood soon caught up to them. Endless bills came knocking on their door every month, among them the dreaded monthly rent. They knew they had to break the circle. Brody, whose family had worked in the delivery industry for decades, had an idea. Seeing that his family had connections when it came to trucks, he pondered the possibility of buying one and renovating it into a mobile home. After a long chat with his fiancée, they concluded that the idea was good. But although it seemed doable, there were several glaring problems that they had to solve first. The prospect of living one's life in a mobile home can be a daunting one, especially if you've never slept outside a house before. For Brody and Annie, moving into a vehicle would be the first time they would sleep outside. Additionally, neither of them understood what went into turning a delivery truck into an actual home. The work ahead was enough to deter them from their goal. But Brody and Annie didn't break under the pressure. They'd already spent 5 years paying hefty sums to their landlord and wanted a way out. Brody talked to one of his brothers who worked in delivery, asking if he could help him find a suitable truck for purchase. This would be the start of a long project that would deliver them from the jaws of paying rent. Brody's brother, Eric, got in touch with some of his trucking buddies and found the perfect vehicle for his brother. It was a white delivery truck with ample space that could be renovated into a home. Without wasting time, Brody and Annie got to work. The first thing they did was find a renovator they could afford. They consolidated their funds, charted the path ahead, and began their journey. The first part of renovating the truck was ensuring it had enough insulation to protect Brody and Annie from the harsh elements when they moved in. Heat exhaustion and hypothermia were among the many dangers if the two didn't take the necessary precautions against them. Their renovator suggested different ways to insulate the truck, such as melanin foam. The couple settled on the best they could afford. But would it be enough to transform the truck into a warm, habitable space? The insulation process took a few weeks to complete, turning the truck into a space Brody and Annie could live. They divided the open space into different compartments, including a bathroom, a kitchen, a living room, and an area meant for a bed. With the vehicle divided into different spaces, the couple began the difficult job of turning it from a delivery truck into an actual home. They had no idea what they'd stepped into. Several acts in the country dictate how people living in mobile homes should live. These include where they can park their vehicles. Brody and Annie didn't take their time to consider all the different factors that went into owning a mobile home. To them, not paying rent had blinded other realities from their sight. They didn't know what a huge mistake they were making. In states like Maryland, unless you own a piece of property to place your mobile home on, the state requires you to rent a space at a mobile home park or at least buy a mobile home already at a park. The premise itself would mean that Brody and Annie would have to pay a monthly fee, the same way they used to do when paying rent. Was all of this a waste of time and money? Brody and Annie had a big issue on their hands. They considered pulling the plug on their investment or at least rolling back the changes. If they'd spent money to turn their truck into their home, they could definitely strip it for parts and sell each of those components. Plus the vehicle, for a good sum. But this route brought its own problem. Brody and Annie had already spent considerable money and time on the truck. Each of the parts they used to transform it into a habitable space was not only costly but hard to find. If they were to strip everything down and sell it back to the market, it would net them half the price they bought them for in the first place. But this wasn't the only issue. The couple had also spent a lot of money on professionals who helped them transform the truck. They would need to hire these experts again to strip it down. Afterward, they would be left with a truck worse than how they bought it. Everything considered, it was clear they would incur many losses. But what could they do? Brody and Annie were nearing the end of their first year after deciding to buy a truck to renovate it. The amount of cash they had poured into the project was massive, with the truck looking spectacular. But they now faced this new issue where they still needed to continue transforming the truck into a home while also worrying about the legal side. They needed a way out. Feeling trapped, Brody sat Annie down. They discussed the matter at length, pulling up YouTube videos of how Americans lived in campers and mobile houses. Watching these videos not only reaffirmed their notion of living in a space they felt comfortable in, But they also experienced a reality that many people living in mobile houses went through every day. Brody and Annie learned living outside was very different from living inside an apartment or house. They had to consider factors such as their truck's drainage and sewage systems, the insulation during colder months, and the lingering stigma of living in such spaces. But although these issues were many, they only made a small percentage of what the two would face as mobile homeowners. They had to uncover everything. There are many issues that surround living in mobile homes. Annie and Brody thought they would have a great time out there, driving from place to place without paying rent. But now that one issue had surfaced, more were cropping up, painting a daunting picture of the two lovebirds. Here is what they uncovered. Brody and Annie had already ascertained that the cost of finding land was already high. But now they discovered that the availability of said land was another issue altogether. Living in a truck meant they would have minimal space to store their belongings. Tack this on to having to worry about different weather conditions all over the country, and the idea of owning and living in a truck suddenly becomes scary. Brody and Annie were encountering all these new problems they hadn't considered before. The honeymoon phase of owning such a vehicle was over, and the two were starting to look at everything objectively. They discovered that the cost of maintaining the motorhome was also high, with fewer options when it came to amenities and personalization options. But although these glaring issues dared scare Brody and Annie away, some positives drew them closer. Among the most notable things that Brody and Annie ran into was the effortless maneuverability of living in a vehicle. Most people living in larger RVs and motorhomes reported that smaller vehicles, such as Brody and Annie's trucks, were easier to maneuver while traveling and searching for a place to park. But there was more. There was no need for Brody and Annie to buy a truck to attach their motorhome to, as everything came as a package for them. Additionally, the route they had taken was far more sustainable than the rest of the options out there. The overall cost of living in a motorhome was also cheaper than living in a house. Although motorhomes are expensive, their cost pales compared to a mortgage and the cost of maintaining a home. But the good news didn't stop there. Brody and Annie discovered that living in a motorhome is more financially sound, since a person has fewer things that will cost them money at the end of the day. There is less room for everything like toys, tools, and clothes, which saves the owner a lot of cash in the long run, as they won't buy as many things. What was the best route for the couple to take with the new information they had? Brody and Annie compared the pros against the cons they had uncovered. Among the most glaring cons was that they would have to pay a monthly fee to park their vehicle. But this was outshined by the fact that they would be living in a space they were proud of, saving money, and touring the country. Slowly, the best way forward presented itself. Brody and Annie's most significant issue was a massive one. But the problem seemed to solve when they realized their home was a truck they would park anywhere. The rest of their issues could efficiently be dealt with the same way problems inherent to living in a house were solved. The couple was confident they could handle this endeavor. After spending time researching the pros and cons, Brody and Annie were now more confident in their ability to own and operate a motorhome. The end of that enlightening journey had affirmed their decision that this was the best move for them. They resumed the remodeling process, picking up where they had left off. Brody and Annie had already finished insulating their vehicle. They also mapped out all the camping sites and regions open to motorhomes in America that they wanted to visit. Since both of them worked from home, they fitted the vehicle with Wi-Fi so they could move across the country, enjoy new sceneries, and simultaneously work and pay off any bills and fees that came their way. But this solution wouldn't be enough. Brody and Annie had always wanted to tour the United States. After all, they came from one of the world's most diverse and beautiful countries. But such a journey, although doable on paper, was much more difficult in reality. It would need a lot of money, which the couple didn't have. They needed to figure out their situation quickly because they'd paid for their last month in their apartment. The end was here. Annie had the idea of continuing to live in their apartment while they turned their truck into a rental space. With enough cash, they could turn it into a business allowing them to buy their fleet of lorries turned into homes while living in a house they could call their own. Brody loved the idea. With Annie and his brother's help, he mapped a business plan for Annie's proposal. But moving forward with Annie's vision would mean one thing. Renting out their truck would mean that Brody and Annie would have to stay a few more months in their apartment. But by the end of the year, the business accumulated enough money to buy and renovate another truck. As it stands, Brody and Annie, now a married couple, run a successful business renting out trucks renovated into homes. They have their own beautiful house but spend time on the road themselves.